Good morning. My name is Tracey Cumming. I am a Senior Technical Advisor with the UNDP-BIOFIN Finance Program. We are here today in the beautiful country of Georgia, and I am very lucky to have my friends and colleagues with me. Andrew Seidl, who's another Senior Technical Advisor with the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. He's also a professor at Colorado State University. And Onno van den Heuvel, who has been the global manager of the BIOFIN program for many years. How many years, Onno?
More than 10 years already.
10 years. So we've been working together for many years, but we don't work out of the same office. We live in different parts of the world, and we very seldom get a chance to kind of just sit back and talk about the work we do in general and reflect on how it's evolved, how it's changed. So that's what I'd really like to do with you two today, is spend some time talking about the field of biodiversity finance, how it's evolved, what it's trying to do in the world, how it's trying to shape the way economies work and the way countries deal with nature, and then reflect on our own program that we work in, BIOFIN, and BIOFIN's role in that. So Andy, as a professor and a teacher and a deep thinker in this space, I'm going to start with you. Could you talk a bit about where biodiversity finance came from and what it's trying to do now?
Sure, I'd love to. It's a really exciting time to work in this realm, in biodiversity finance. Likely biodiversity finance is a natural evolution of conservation finance, where conservation finance was really focused on how do we manage parks and protected areas in an adequate manner. And then folks decided or realized that the remit for understanding financing nature is much broader than that, and it's much broader than parks and protected areas, and thus biodiversity finance sort of moved into that niche. Back in the 90s and 2000s, economists were using tools of non-market valuation to raise awareness about the value of nature, and we saw a number of publications come out. The Wealth of Nature is the Wealth of Nations by the World Bank. A lot of this sort of work became the basis for natural capital accounting that we see today. At the same time, while awareness was being raised, folks also realized that we didn't really have a good handle on where the investments were coming from, or how do we go about financing or increasing the value or the stewardship of biodiversity worldwide. Around 2002, I think IUCN was the first publication that came out, and it was simply on how do you finance the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And that moved into an era where we were increasingly thinking about broadening the remit of finance to include biodiversity more explicitly. But really, biodiversity finance hit the main stage, I think, at the COP10 in Nagoya. In the COP10, many of the donor nations were looking for additional funds. They're saying, we need more money. Or the recipient nations were saying, we need more money to invest in biodiversity. We want to do it, we just don't have the money. The donors were saying, well, sure, we have money, but what are you currently spending it on? And can you tell us, what the results of this investment over the last years have been? The COP at that point was looking into having a strategic plan for 2010 to 2020. And so these were going to be large strategic investments made by countries and also investments in new programming for recipient countries. When it came around to it, they figured out that, one, we don't really know how much is being spent or invested. Two, we don't really know how much we need. And three, we don't need to really know how we're going to get from here to there. What are the tools available to us in order to sufficiently finance that National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan and also the 2010 to 2020 strategic plan of the CBD. Right at that same time, the very first publication on the little book of Finance of Nature came out at the COP, and it really launched a broader discussion about how do we go about solving these wicked problems on global biodiversity finance. BIOFIN then was hatched out of this lack of information and said, how do we answer these questions?
Yeah. I also love how biodiversity finance has moved from how do we get more money into this field to how do we change economic systems to make sure we're not spending so much money on harming nature? How do we change things like harmful subsidies or just bad practices in the economy? Because that's always going to be so much more powerful than any money we bring in to fix those things. So I love how that concept is really spread around the world, and that's the type of work that we're trying to do with countries, which brings me to Onno. You've nurtured BIOFIN from a very small project to this global network of countries in this space, in this amazing time when biodiversity finance has gone from a costing exercise to a huge approach for governments to look, and private sector to look at nature. Could you say a little bit about BIOFIN's role and where we've come from and the type of work we're doing?
Yes, absolutely happy to do so. And I think you have to look at BIOFIN being actually different things at different levels. So I think first of all, it's a global community of countries that are sharing their knowledge in meetings like the one we are today, very actively with each other, sharing their learning, sharing their results, and doing this at the regional and at the global level. And we have this community now across 2 programs of 132 countries, and also via our knowledge products and the website and YouTube channel and so on. And I think the second level that we can look at is the BIOFIN core concepts and methodology, which, as you already pointed at, has 4 dimensions. So we're not just exclusively looking at finding more money for biodiversity. We also have sort of 3 other lenses that you can look at any finance flow with. So the second one is realigning finance that is likely to have a negative impact on nature. And we also, very importantly, want to improve the effectiveness of funding that's already there. And this is in particular relevant for public budgets. So we want to do more with money that's already available by setting, for example, very clear targets or looking at making processes more efficient. And the last one, which is sometimes a bit more indirect, is what we call preventing future cost. But when you look at, for example, private sector investment, it becomes more concrete. For example, we can try to attract more investment in ecotourism now to prevent another type of tourism from happening with a very high footprint in the future. And the third level that we can look at it is a national process, which is answering some of the questions that Andy raised. How much are we spending, public and private sector, how much finance do we need, and what is our best strategy for our country to reconcile those two? But it's not just about that data and information, it's really a journey of several stakeholders, in particular the Ministry of Finance and the finance sector and central banks, and the environment community, the biodiversity community, NGOs, local communities, environment ministries, bringing those together with yet further ministries like, for example, agriculture or fisheries or tourism, and starting a dialogue that lasts not 1 or 2 years, but perhaps 5, 10, or maybe even 20 years to look at this issue, and developing, first of all, a new vision for biodiversity finance. What are the priorities in the country, and what are the solutions that are the best fit for our country? And now we have developed something called the BIOFIN Workbook, and that's exactly a very practical step-by-step guidance for this journey, going through all those different elements of the BIOFIN approach. And the finance plan itself is the most important one, obviously, with very concrete actions on the public and private, traditional, innovative sides that are designed by national stakeholders and selected by national stakeholders. And this is a very important element of the BIOFIN formula. It's very much relying on homegrown solutions and a bottom-up process. But the really most important step is then implementation of this plan, because there's so many other plans out there that have been designed, it's not always that evident how they're supposed to be implemented. There's not always a dedicated implementation stage. So we have this dedicated implementation stage, and this is the stage that takes the longest. And some countries already work on the implementation for 5 years now, on very practical solutions to raise finance. And we have seen actually finance results coming out of that. In total, already more than $600 million in finance results, things like public budgets, also things like green bonds, so many different solutions. We're going to talk about that hopefully a bit later on. But that's really the core idea. So you have that community at the global level, you have that community at the national level, and you have these very concrete actions leading to finance results for nature and away from harmful expenditures.
It's something I also love about the work I get to do with BIOFIN is we operate at this conceptual level, kind of part of a broader community, but kind of at the cutting edge of what this field is trying to do. And at the same time, the only way we can do our work really well is to really get into the details at a national level. You were talking about the different steps in understanding expenditure, and I was thinking of one of the countries I worked with years ago, and we looked at an expenditure review of biodiversity in the country, and what we identified in that particular country is they were allocating a decent amount of funding for nature, but the relevant departments weren't able to spend it. And it's a tiny detail, but it then could unlock a whole program of work around, that's where the problem is, that's where the bottleneck is. It isn't motivating for more money, it's saying there's a capacity issue here, there's a monitoring problem here, there's an evaluation issue here, and that's why the money isn't flowing. And every country is so different, and unless you really understand, you take the time, and for our countries it takes about 2 years to do all that analytical work. You take the time to really understand the details of it, you can then develop the suite of approaches in each country that is so well suited to what that particular country needs. So let's talk about that a bit more. Andy, you support countries. I think you're the most widespread of all of the senior technical advisors. You're across the board. I can't imagine your time zone challenges. Are there a couple of country examples that you would like to share?
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things I like the most about working with BIOFIN is that it's not a one-trick pony, that we have 150 or 160 different potential options and combinations of options above that we can try to implement in various countries, and we can do that in a way that's fit for purpose. So just a couple of years ago, we had a little bit of a pandemic that came through, and that caused, among lots of other things, those countries that were most highly dependent upon international tourism to really have a rough go. We saw it yesterday when we went to National Park here in Georgia. The visitation went from 60,000 per year down to 6,000 per year, so 90% loss. Those are important revenues for managing parks and protected areas. And BIOFIN saw that, I think, fairly early on, that this is going to harm our country's economic outcomes and livelihoods of people who depend upon parks and protected areas or international tourism in particular. And so we pivoted. We said, okay, well, how can we provide some short-term solutions to at least bridge the gap, not knowing how long that gap was going to be, in some important ecosystems and biomes. And so we came upon crowdfunding as one way to at least help in pivotal areas. And well, we didn't know all that much about crowdfunding at that point, but we tried to figure it out. And so there's a UNDP Crowdfunding Academy. We used their information, and we looked among our countries to look at some of the more iconic or at-risk ecosystems or species, and put together 4 different crowdfunding campaigns that in total came to, I believe, around $3 million of altruistic giving that helped to support the Galapagos in Ecuador, the Tamaras in Philippines, Blue Hole in Belize, and reforestation in northern Costa Rica, including many female-led entrepreneurial enterprises in that Costa Rican case. So this is a big win, I think, for us as an initiative to be able to pivot like that and to be fit for purpose and to react to challenges. On top of that, we saw, okay, when we do come out of this, lots of countries are going to be in a fiscal space that's really challenging. And so we started to look more seriously at risk instruments. It wasn't so much part of our original portfolio, but now it's a big part of our portfolio because so many countries are trying to figure out how to navigate this new fiscal environment given the damage that the pandemic did to their economies. So we're looking more often at insurance and debt for nature swaps, and for all the risk bonds are also risk-related sorts of instruments, and we're looking at that from Indonesia to Bhutan to Nepal and across the globe to try to help make sure that we don't lose the momentum that countries have in investing in a future that we can all be proud of.
It's exactly. There's no one silver bullet. It's the suite that might be short term, it might be long term, it might be fundamental systemic change, and that package collectively is what's really helping countries to resolve this funding challenge. Onno, you also have a very wide overview of all the different country success stories that we've had over the years. Any particular highlights you'd like to share?
Yes, I'm very happy to share several, but I first want to mention that just like a good wine, success needs time to mature, and it's not something you do overnight. It's often quite difficult to understand if you haven't worked on this topic. And so the examples I want to share have been the result of an extended process of national consultation and policy work. And the first one is from the Philippines, where we worked on public budgets for protected areas. And back in the very first stages of the BIOFIN process, you're also doing an analysis of the finance landscape and relevant policies. And what they found was actually protected areas, most of them didn't receive a lot of funding actually. And so they started to investigate, why is that? Well, there was one really fundamental reason. So more than 90 protected areas were officially proclaimed, but not actually formally gazetted because they have to be written into the law. And so they worked with a parliament member to get those protected areas written into the law. And that law was approved by the Congress of the Philippines. And they also followed up with underlying regulations to specify some of the details, and also including things like public and private partnerships. And then they worked on a new proposal for a very high budget increase for those protected areas, which is more than $40 million. And that too has been approved by the Congress of the Philippines. And ever since, there have been significant budget increases for protected areas in the Philippines, and they're already cumulatively more than $80 million. And so it just goes to show that you really have to look at the fundamental barriers for financing and address them. And you cannot necessarily go for like a quick gain in having more money. So a very similar example actually comes from Kazakhstan, where as well they noticed that relatively less money is going to protected areas. And they observed that in the legislation, it doesn't necessarily say that finance should go to protected area management plans. And so they helped to amend the legislation in 2017, which now says protected area management plans must be developed and financed very explicitly. And they also worked in partnership with the GF-related program on a new generation of high-quality management plans. And these plans are coming into effect now, and we have seen in the last years also a budget increase of around $70 million for the protected area system of the Kazakhstan, and that's very significant. And I can challenge you to find countries that have this kind of budget to begin with. It's actually not that many. And another example for this kind of need for the long haul is coming from Zambia. In Zambia, we have a really interesting, fascinating model with a very close engagement of the finance sector, engaging with the central bank and many other organizations. Securities and Exchange Commission in particular plays a lead role. And they selected green bonds as the finance solution they want to focus on primarily. And so we have developed, the government has developed a national framework for green bonds. And this has been put in place a few years ago. And then, very importantly, they also created a system of fiscal incentives. So we all know that green bonds are good, but they do require additional reporting, and all the better if the government can take this bold step of making it more attractive to issue and purchase green bonds, and they've done. So actually there are 3 different fiscal incentives that have been combined for both the issuers and the purchasers, and they've been also put into place. And then logically the next step would be to issue the first green bond, but at the same time, due to the pandemic that was already mentioned by Andy, national budgets were very much under pressure, and it wasn't necessarily a good idea or even possible to issue a sovereign green bond, and so they started to look at possibilities for a corporate green bond. And just last year in December, the first corporate green bond was issued, registered for an amount of $200 million, with the first tranche of $50 million already being issued. And it goes to show that there are these big opportunities both in the public and the private sector, and again, that you need time. So you have to recalibrate your solutions. This is not something that you do overnight, and sometimes the result comes only after a number of years, and this is why we really have the vision to continue for a long time, and we actually have currently set our bar to at least continue until 2030 with this program.
I know when we first started looking at things like green bonds and green strategies, I certainly had this assumption that nature's part of that, and that's great. Green bonds are fantastic. But as we started delving into these things, a lot of us in our countries and even at the global level started realizing that green sometimes just means climate, or sometimes just means hard infrastructure, and nature often actually hadn't been considered, or even nature safeguards hadn't been considered. And we were running into situations where green funding resulted in planting alien invasive trees for carbon sequestration, which was having potentially terrible impacts on nature and water sources. And that's another way we have to come in to say, are there safeguards for nature? Is blue economy good for nature? Or is it not? Are green bonds actually good for nature? And how do we make sure that happens at a global level and at a national level?
And I would like to pick up on that, going back to the example of Zambia. And when people say, what's the link between green bonds and nature? I say, welcome to the multiverse. Because the connection can be different at different levels. So first of all, you have a side level impact. And some green bonds are, for example, about renewable energy and windmills.
Right.
Well, they're good for the world. They may have negative impacts on birds. There's so many studies out there that millions of birds are in fact dying from windmills, but doesn't mean that this is not something to go for, but we just have to keep that in mind. We have to build strong safeguards. But the second level beyond the side impact is really looking at the drivers of loss, and this is where biodiversity becomes complex and fascinating. So biodiversity is not a sector. It's an issue to integrate in every sector, and we have to find out what are the drivers of loss in every country. And this was the case in Zambia as well. So there's a lot of use of charcoal. And only if we have an alternative energy source, we can reduce the use of charcoal, which is a major cause of deforestation. But if you don't know that this is a driver of loss, then we wouldn't be able to make this link. So it's actually another important step in the BIOFIN process that we haven't highlighted perhaps as much, is to analyze in every country the drivers of loss and gain and try to find a financing solution that respond to those drivers. It's also really critical.
And one of the first things that we try to get countries to do when we start with our policy and institutional review, it's not just who are the players, but also what are the root causes of the challenges that you're facing, and let's have that as our starting point. And hopefully that's the starting point for ultimately developing a biodiversity finance plan, but also a starting point for how do you think about national biodiversity strategies and action plans, where those biodiversity plans can say, oh, there's a bunch of economic root causes that we really need to address before we can expand our protected areas, et cetera, et cetera. Also on the topic of drivers of loss, and shifting behavior at a national level, we're starting to look at subsidies in other sectors, seeing if they're good for nature or not, and seeing if there are ways that we can better integrate national and global objectives for nature into these subsidies so that countries can still achieve their water security or food security objectives without harming nature. And this is relatively new for us. It's relatively new. No one really in the world is doing a lot of work here. I love that we're pioneers in this space. Acknowledging it's very difficult to do. It's complex. It's politically sensitive, and I think our countries are being incredibly thoughtful and courageous in unpacking these complex issues and starting to really understand and bring together the different actors at a country level, the different ministries to have these conversations. How can we still achieve all the different sustainable development goals and have subsidies that reflect the spectrum of sustainable development goals, not just one goal versus another goal. So I love that we do that work. So on the topic of the evolution of our field, I don't think it's going to stop. I think we're going to keep evolving. So here's the tricky question. I'm going to throw it at you first. What's next? In 5 years' time, in 2030, a lot of our targets, our global biodiversity framework targets are to 2030. There are a lot of biodiversity finance issues in those targets. When we gather, hopefully we will all see each other again at another global conference or regional dialogue. What will be our framework? What will be our big issues that we're talking about in 2030?
Great question, of course. I think perhaps three things come to mind. The first one being that would be top of mind in 5 years. I think we're going to increasingly be concerned about the trifecta of climate change, biodiversity, and livelihoods, and particularly livelihoods among folks who are not necessarily in the formal economy. So indigenous people, native populations, but also people who are living at subsistence and living, especially in coastal zone areas. Billions actually of people live and depend on ocean resources who are not being seen in the formal economy. So to the extent that we can wed those three big issues in our solutions so we avoid making additional mistakes, that's going to be huge going forward and hugely important to our success. Secondly, I think although the bumper sticker ready, think globally, act locally is really the calling of biodiversity finance, where almost all biodiversity finance expenditures are done at the local level. We also have to keep in mind that the solutions may actually be above that local level. They may be at a different scale. And so I think we're increasingly going to look at multi-jurisdictional, multi-country, greater spatial awareness of our solutions, both on efficiency grounds, but also on effectiveness grounds. So you think of Coral Triangle, for example. One country can't tackle the Coral Triangle problem. And so clearly, ocean finance, ocean governance, ocean finance, it's 2/3 of the planet. We have to do better. We just have to do better. And that is going to be front of mind going forward. And then the third thing I would think about is that so many of our solutions require biodiversity to be damaged in order for there to be a business case. That is, it pays to restore things, and it doesn't pay to keep things pristine. And that's wrong. That's clearly wrong. We have to figure out how to get around that problem. The business case in the short term is quite clear that restoration pays, and it's also quite clear that it often doesn't pay to keep things pristine. But in the long run, there's no debating that it'll cost us less, and we will be better off if we maintain what we have rather than ruin it and bring it back. And so we have to be better at figuring out how to incentivize or create the opportunities for that extant nature to thrive. Those would be my three things in 5 years.
All good things. And on the restoration point, we know from ecologists that just restoring nature isn't that easy. Firstly, it can take many, many years. And secondly, you might never actually get it back to pristine state. So even if you separate the cost of it, the massive, massive cost of it, the chances of success are not necessarily guaranteed. So that's something we really do want to avoid. Onno, what do you think?
I want to go back to your question 1 about the history of biodiversity finance to reflect on the future. Because we can consider that the history of biodiversity finance started with the protected areas and the finance, but we can also consider that it started when we had the first investment that had a negative impact on nature, which led to deforestation, loss of habitats, and so on. So this history is actually pretty long if you see it from that perspective. And now looking at then what we need for the future is, I think, follow the vision of what the UNDP has under the Nature Pledge, which really is that every organization in every sector has to consider nature and apply the nature lens to major investment decisions, public and private. So no longer biodiversity finance should be the domain of a small group of people, but we have to work towards a system where impacts on nature and risk are integrated into all the major fiscal decisions, public and private investments. So I think this is kind of the idea that we have for the future. And in particular, with the private sector, there's a lot happening right now. There's a huge momentum around things like the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And we see that already hundreds of companies have signed up to start checking their finances. So to see what are their dependencies on nature, what are risks related to nature they're exposed to, and what are their impacts. And that's something that could dramatically change the financial system. And so while this is a kind of system of self-reporting, we have to be then ready to help countries to respond to this hopefully increased change in investments. And I think this is going to be one of the most fundamental challenges moving forward to better catalyze private investments in nature. I think for public investments, it's a bit more clear, like this is your menu of options that you have. But for private, it's just so much harder, because biodiversity is still a public good most of the time. And so we have to have a multi-dimensional approach to working with the private sector. So there's the reporting and TNFD work stream. There's also the safeguards and preventing negative investments and working on subsidies. But we also have to, in particular, help to identify portfolio of investable projects. This is something that private sector counterparts and investors are telling us a lot. We don't have anywhere to invest right now. So there's this, on the one hand, a lot of people having biodiversity projects all around the world. They're usually kind of small, not necessarily managed on a for-profit basis. And there's this huge investor community out there, which often is ready to invest, but the missing middle is really what's needed. And we are working on a new vehicle called the Nature Facility. That is one of those, bridges in the middle, which is kind of doing 3 things. It's working on creating the optimal enabling environment, so to see where the enabling environment can be improved. So the example I mentioned from Zambia as one such, type of action. And also looking at direct investments, and as well as in particular helping with this pipeline of project, which seems to be a very fundamental issue. So I think we're going to hopefully see a very big shift in private sector investments. But also back to the public sector, we are doing this expenditure review in countries, which is great data, but why should this be needed is a question you can ask. So we have seen some countries like Indonesia and Mexico and Malawi integrating this expenditure review into their budget tracking systems. And I think that's something all countries need to consider. So no longer we can separate our mainstream economy from the biodiversity conservation priorities, but we really have to integrate in all public finance investment decision measures to measure the impact on biodiversity. So for the public finance, the positive side, it can be expenditure tagging, and for the negative side, we really need to step up on screening. So we have this work on subsidies that you refer to, where we help countries to identify what's the negative impact on nature. This should not be needed, because countries should have screening systems in place. I think a big priority is also establishing those screening systems in countries, so that it's a default option that if you have a new subsidy, you're always checking the impact on biodiversity for any subsidy that you create.
A lot of what you're talking about is currently sitting in our Global Biodiversity Framework targets. So it's really, and we know we don't always meet our targets. We didn't meet a lot of the Aichi targets. Things like the subsidies, relevant target, even a lot of targets haven't been met before, but in our new targets for 2030, Target 14 is about integrating the values of nature into public and private budgets and decision making. Target 15 is about really integrating integrating the right systems into the private sector to reduce harm as well as increase funding. So it's a big ask, but I think it's something. I've never been more positive, and I've been doing work in this field for some years now, and I've never been more positive and impressed by the speed that the things are picking up. The private sector is coming to the table and almost starting to drag the public sector forward, which has never been the case before, saying things like, we want to do this, we want to integrate nature into our decision making, please put the regulation in place, change the rules of the game so that we can all play that game. Because it's hard to play that game when the rules are still the old rules, and the old rules don't respect or even recognize the role of nature. So I am generally optimistic as a person, so I'd like to think that the things that we're talking about, we will be able to do, and when we report back in 2030, we'll have some really positive results coming out of countries and in the global community. Thank you so much for talking to me. It was really great, and I hope we can continue the discussion. And wonderful to see you in person, not just your heads on Zoom calls. For those listening, thank you for listening or watching, joining in. If you want to know anything more about the UNDP-BIOFIN work, we have a website, www.biofin.org. You can see our methodology, you can see our conceptual approach, and you can read all of our incredibly exciting and really inspiring country stories from the countries that are part of our network. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tracey.
Pleasure.